From KUOW in Seattle, this is Soundside. I'm Hans Anderson. We're taking the week off and playing some of our favorite segments from this year. Coming up on the show today, we'll hear from bus driver and author Nathan Voss. His latest book documents the stories of people across the city, one bus ride at a time. That's coming up in about 20 minutes. But first, we're revisiting an interview with Seattle's newest civic poet, Duji Tahat. Diana Opong spoke with Duji in March of this year when they were taking over the Post. Here's Diana.
Duji Tahat can be described in many ways. A poet, sure. A critic, yes. But they're also a podcast host, a political consultant, a parent, and generally friendly person who is sitting right across from me right now in the KUOW studios. In addition to all those titles, they can now add a new descriptor. Seattle's fifth civic poet. Since 2015, the Civic Poet has served as an ambassador to the art form by making poetry more accessible to residents. Duji Tahat, thank you so much for being here, and congrats on becoming Seattle's fifth civic poet.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's really a pleasure to be here as a NPR fan and a Soundside fan. I'm honored.
Well, in this role, Duji, I'd love to understand, how you're acting as the conduit between the people and the city and poetry. What are you thinking about as you enter this position?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the way the previous civic poets have done such a really excellent job surfacing poetry around the city. And I think in large part because of my own day job, I'm really interested in sort of bringing poetry into City Hall and into sort of like the mundane provincial work of policymaking. I think that policymaking is so much also about language. It's so much about how our lives are structured through language. And as much as any time in the history of humans and language and policymaking, I think that we could really use better reading skills. And I really mean like reading skills as like a collective kind of looking at a reality, looking at a set of words and apprehending a reality, a shared reality together through language. And so, the project itself is kind of straightforward, where I read poems with civic leaders, elected officials, the citizen boards and commissions. We read a couple poems, and then we sort of talk about them. And then that sort of ends up framing a discussion or conversation about the policies and issues that they're working on.
Okay, so policy being influenced by reflecting on poetry. Okay, I like this approach. And poetry is known as a stodgy art form. I think that, and that's because of the types of poetry that were taught in school. There's Keats, Coleridge, etc. How do you counteract this perception and help people connect with poetry? Because surprise, surprise, not everybody is a poetry fan.
Among many great American crises, the teaching of poetry is one of them. I come to poetry by way of just like ordinary people, through Youth Speaks and Slam, which is to say, too, that I inherit a tradition of social poetics, of the poetry that has actually endured beyond Keats and Coleridge is like the kind of poetry told around fires before there was written language, song. If we expand our definition of poetry to include also pop music, I would actually suggest that everyone is a fan of poetry. We just conceive of it culturally at this particular moment a really specific way. And so I think everyone is kind of a fan of feeling things, or everyone is a fan of having a container to feel things in.
Okay.
There are different ways to sort of assess like what is good or what is your taste. Right. That is important too. There's room for that. But I think the sort of conversation I'm interested in is like, well, actually we're all interested in that. So how do we all sort of look at poems together and actually encounter poems that like sometimes like are not for us or make us feel things that make us feel really uncomfortable, but that's like not actually about the poem itself.
Right.
And how do we sort of begin to tease those things out? Because I think the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to like just be with each other in our own discomfort and our own sort of uncertainty, because I think ultimately what we're talking about is like feelings are tricky and complicated.
Yes.
And so poems as vehicles for that are also that. And I think trying to sort of narrow and reduce it is a failing effort. And so sort of expanding the definition, reminding folks that there are as many different kinds of poems as there are people. So if you're a person who feels like you don't like poems, it's probably just that you haven't found the poem for you.
Or a delivery style, because like you mentioned, there's different ways in which poetry can exist that I don't know if people have ever considered, right?
Totally.
There's slam poetry, like you said, there's singing, there's call and response and sort of duet poetry or group poetry where
Totally.
people are sharing lyrics together. I've never thought about a pop song being poetry.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I truly believe in this sort of the broadest expansive definition of poems. You know, I had a friend sort of talk about people who fish. They say they read the water. As like a sort of literary, and you know, this is like a very poety thing to say, but it's like, you know, that's like a literary way of encountering a poem. You know, if what we mean by poem is like apprehending a set of things and sort of like looking deeply and sort of being moved by the thing that you're looking deeply at. If that, you know, I would say like in the broadest sense, right? Like that's what it means to read a poem.
How did Seattle shape your relationship with poetry?
In every way, in every sort of conceivable way. You know, I had an interest in language at a really young age. You know, high school was really helpful in terms of, you know, composition classes are really helpful in terms of being like, I discovered I had kind of a faculty with writing poems, but really it was discovering Youth Speak Seattle. I grew up in Eastern Washington in Yakima. And once I got a car and sort of discovered You Speak Seattle, I was kind of driving here pretty frequently.
From Yakima?
From Yakima, yeah.
Whoa.
I would come here to Youth Speak's events. At first, I was kind of a lurker, but then I sort of mustered up the courage to participate in writing circles and a slam. I was lucky enough to sort of do well in the slam cycle one year and represent Seattle at Brave New Voices. And, you know, again, like when I say that, like, sort of I belong to sort of a social poetic tradition, it is really that, you know, the community of youth slam and the way that sort of transitioned into an adult slam community. I learned how to write and read in a circle with other people. We didn't like workshop in the sort of academic sense of workshop. We like read our stuff at open mics and then we like found out what worked by listening to ourselves, listening to a room, listening to us. I would say, too, I think Seattle has a really long tradition of this kind of social poetics that extends far beyond certainly my time. When I was writing and, you know, sort of competing nationally, we had a reputation for being deep thinkers and good writers. And I would say that that's true because I think You Speak Seattle in particular is like a social justice program masquerading as a writing program. So I learned to think really deeply about people and place. And that, I think, has come to inform my day job as a political consultant, the way I move in the world, how I parent, everything.
I love that so much. Well, Doogie, I want to hear one of your poems. What do you want to read?
All-American Ghazal. In Douglas County, there is another American wildfire. So, in my poems about language, there are wildfires. Before the smoke made the July sky a slate slab, I knew, living closer to sagebrush, the way wildfires disappeared people's belongings. Having dug ditches around their homes, my peoples watched a fire. I've never been to Lake Chelan, I tell Marisol, who calls Mason home, who maybe thinks we're each other's people. Are they my people, who were never told they could leave, who kept picking apples even as the flaming ridge closed in? Hurricanes get human names. Yet no matter the acreage, the place is called the damage wrecked by a wildfire. My people hug the shore of the Sound, lamenting another gray month in an otherwise perfect summer watching wildfires. Here we photo filter our catastrophes. Big and slow hides our flaws, our boozy sourness, and abutment spires to reveal a crack in a 100-year-old bridge. Subduction is so close to seduction, and that's yet another catastrophe. Can coders contour my consumption? I was born the day Mount Pinatubo erupted, a year later, so I don't know lahars or where, when I look out my window, the highest ground is to run to. My kids, on the other side of the city, don't wildfire, but mature in the specter of a tsunami that has yet made landfall. Selfishly, I try disappearing. Call it ecstasy. My God, here I am, an Abrahamic contract imagining Doogie, a valley in a valley, a heavy ringing, a blazing wildfire.
Doogie, can you describe what a ghazal is and why you chose that form?
Yeah, totally. So my primary way I write is through form, just as a constraint for myself. I find it to be really generative. Ghazals are a particular form that comes from the Arabic and Persian traditions. It's a really ancient form. You can sort of sense the sort of there's a rhyme scheme in particular, and the poet sort of signs off at the end their own name. So right now I've been working on the series of poems. They're all called All-American Ghazal. I'm just sort of like working through what that might mean. Even the phrase, all American ghazal. The ghazal is like distinctly non-Western form.
Got it.
And so to sort of like suggest or imply, I think through my own experience, like what it means to be all American, despite like what sort of tradition and policy and contemporary politics might tell you is not American, and sort of to expand that definition. And I think by doing so too, to maybe like play around with the rules of the ghazal itself. There are a lot of different kinds of form over time and all around the world. They are, I think, poetic traditions that are sort of aligned in specific form, like sonnets, villanelles, sestinas. For me, I'm someone who's obsessed with form. I'm what other poets would consider a formalist, where I sort of am enamored with the way a particular form might offer a way to refresh language to tell a really particular truth. I think of form as a way to get at language more honestly, more clearly. And so I get obsessed with a really specific one.
Okay.
And then I write through a specific form. I write maybe 50 poems in that form, most of them very bad. And then a few of them are, worth sort of looking at again and hopefully eventually sharing if they're really good.
I want to make sure that I understand the different kinds of forms. So obviously sonnet, that's something we probably all heard in school. Are haikus a form?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your role as a civic poet isn't a political position per se, even though you do work as a political consultant, but you do work within that city government space. What do you think poetry can offer politics?
Yeah. So I guess I would suggest that everything is political, right? That is my sort of core belief. I think having a civic poet is a political statement by the city about the value of poetry, about poetry's relationship to the city, how the city views itself, and what is important to the people of the city. That to me feels like a political statement. It's a line item in the budget. Budgets are political documents. So I kind of reject that proposition that the civic poet is sort of, and that art itself is sort of like apolitical.
Got it.
I say that to say that, what I think poetry invites us to do is to listen, sit quietly with our thoughts and a reality as presented through language. And I'll be damned if that's not also the definition of policymaking, or good policymaking, certainly. But I think the sort of political context we live in incentivizes not doing that. The sort of urgency of the moment, the sort of like false urgency of having to do something right now, skipping over the steps of like listening.
And connecting.
And again, like looking at a truth together. I keep thinking about E.J. KUOW, who's this poet in Seattle. She has a really great memoir called The Magical Language of Others. And in it, there's this line, it's a memoir. And she's speaking with the professor, and her professor says something about how the poet can say anything because they say it magnanimously. And so I'm really interested in like, what would our civic discourse look like if there was more magnanimity in it? If we were less, as a political operative about our language. If we were less driven by the outcome of every sort of point in time specific action and more invested in the process of learning from each other. It is, in the same way that sort of poets can say anything magnanimously, we can disagree about policy solutions to specific things. But if we cannot agree on the reality, if we cannot agree on the sort of set of conditions that demand a policy solution in the first place, then something is broken. And I think that is sort of where we're at, not just at the city level, right? This is so far beyond. You can see it happen in sort of every level of politics and government. So I think if there is any sort of hope, or like if there is a value to what poetry can do, and I think, in my wildest dreams, what my project would hope to do is sort of have us all have civic leaders, elected officials, commissions and boards sort of square with the reality, to be able to look at reality together, even if, again, we disagree on sort of specific policy solutions, to like agree to a reality, to understand, have a shared language for like what the issue is, what is the scale of the issue, what can we do, what is the universe of things that we can do.
Duji Tahat is the new Seattle civic poet. Thank you so much, Duji.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
And that interview originally aired in March of this year. You're listening to Soundside. When we come back, a Metro bus driver and author shares his perspective on Seattle's highs and lows. That's after the break here on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Hans Anderson. When you ride a Metro bus that Nathan Voss is driving, you might notice a few things. It starts when you get on the bus. He makes a point of saying hello to every passenger who climbs aboard. Once you grab a seat, you'll see he's just naturally chatty. He's on the intercom announcing every single stop, talks with people sitting at the front of the bus, and when you step off the bus, he says goodbye. What you may not realize is that Nathan is paying close attention to everything happening around him, the conversations he's having, and the regulars who show up every day. He often writes about these interactions, and those stories are compiled in a new book called Deciding to See, The View from Nathan's Bus. The book is a collection of dozens of narratives of daily interactions across the city, touching on loss, joy, and connection on a King County Metro bus. Nathan spoke with Libby Dankman in May about this book. Here's that conversation.
So you drive routes that I think many riders and folks who know anything about Metro would say, they're like maybe the more challenging routes to drive. Where do you drive?
Yes. I favor the 7. The E-line is great too, the 49, the 7 and 49 when they were connected. And in terms of why I drive those ones, I know that those are the routes that everyone else hates to drive, but it's not because I think they're like somehow edgy or dangerously cool. I'm not a risk taker, especially not at work.
And just to be clear, these are really popular routes. They have a lot of riders, and they also have, because of that and because of some of the areas they drive in, they might have more safety concerns.
Exactly. A lot of safety and security, especially because I prefer driving at night for reasons we can go into. But no, I like doing those because I tend to find that there's a stronger sense of community in those areas. There's statistical data which bears out the idea that unsafe neighborhoods often have a stronger sense of community because people have to rely on each other to survive. And it's nice to be driving the bus where it's loud because everyone's talking to each other, catching up, asking about each other's kids. It feels like you're part of something living, a community. And I really like that. I prefer that to the more like stereotypical Seattle freeze type situation where everyone's dead silent. If I got to be on the bus for 8 hours, I want to have fun.
And so let me ask you about the nighttime routes. Why night?
Okay, well, I think it's easier. They're paying you the same amount, but there's no traffic. There's no like construction zones, school zones, like all these things, delivery trucks, the commuters, the traffic push.
But doesn't stuff get weird at night?
Sometimes, Libby, it does. But
you're okay with that?
Yeah, there's like more mental headspace to deal with stuff. You don't have to think about traffic or cars. You can focus on whatever you need to focus on. And usually it works out pretty good. Of course, there's a few days out of every year that are spectacularly challenging, but all the rest of the days of the year are something I need to remember. Those happen too. Those are great days. And if the Metro bus is sort of a mobile living room where everything glorious and terrible about humanity is packed into that space, there's a lot of goodness there. And that's what I'm trying to highlight with the book.
This is your second book. And
Yes.
so listeners may be familiar with your voice. But for folks who don't know you, how did you get into bus driving?
This is going to sound silly, but I always wanted to. As a child, I loved buses because all children love things that are huge, like dinosaurs. But my reason for liking buses now is completely different than when I was a little kiddo. For me, it's the social element now. It's the opportunity to give back to the community, to participate in community, to have no intermediary between myself and the people that I'm helping, to be able to look folks in the eye. And there's something really gratifying about being out there on sort of ground zero, we might say, the vortex of the city. And buses are just such a fascinating place to be. Also, it's the best artist day job because it pays well and it doesn't intrude into your off hours. You have no like Monday morning deadlines and stuff. So you have time to go home and write your book about bus stories.
Yeah, you leave the bus and it doesn't follow you home.
Exactly. It doesn't follow me home.
Okay.
Thank goodness. Yeah.
So you were taking this active role in catching up with people, greeting them, like I said, announcing the stops. When I ride the bus, I tend to encounter drivers who are very professional, very good at their job, but they're quiet. They're not necessarily making a lot of conversation with everybody. Have you always sort of just naturally been somebody who was outgoing, and so you brought that to the job, or was that a conscious choice for you to like be a more engaged socially driver?
Great question. I was super shy as a child. And I worked at Capitol Records in Hollywood, where I was the little mail delivery boy, and I had to get signatures from everyone in every office all up and down the tower. That was the first time where I was sort of in a position where I had to make small talk with everyone. I had to get to know people. I would be a very different bus driver if I hadn't had that job. Even so, when I started driving at Metro, I was quiet. I was focusing on driving. It's pretty overwhelming when you're starting out at that job. But a few years in, I realized this job becomes dramatically more rewarding if I treat everyone as if they're already friends of mine. It really changes things. From a safety perspective, if I'm making eye contact and greeting everybody who comes in, it defuses them. It stops a lot of security things before they even happen. People love being seen and respected and heard. And for that reason, it seemed like a great thing to do. Also, it's just really gratifying to talk with strangers. There's a sort of neurochemical reaction your brain has when you have a positive interaction with a stranger, where you feel this sense of belonging to society at large, to humanity. And you can't get that specific neurochemical reaction from interacting with your friends or your family, because your friends and family are not humanity at large. Strangers are. And so it gives me a lot of joy to have a job where I have 8 hours potentially to have that sort of vibe with folks.
And you're interacting with people who are having the whole spectrum of human experiences. They might be going to work, but they also might be, drunk and trying to get home at night, or like trying to get to the hospital, or, there's various, they're taking their kids somewhere. What is the role, do you think, of the bus driver? You talked about diffusing tension in some ways. Besides getting somebody from point A to point B, like, what do you see your role as on the bus?
I feel like there are so many problems that I witness people going through, so many challenges, people often not on their best days, going through difficult times. And the ability to solve those problems is well outside my purview. I don't have the ability to do that. What I can do is bear witness. I try to just be there as a smiling, respectful, friendly presence. Hopefully that makes them feel better for 5 minutes. If I can do that, it's worth it that I got out of bed to come to work. And often that's all I can do. But it's rewarding to have someone tell me, you're the first person to say hi to me all day today, stuff like that. It can make a difference.
What's your process like for getting the stories down in the book? Because there's a lot of detail. I mean, you're quoting people extensively. You're driving when you're having these conversations.
Right,
yeah, what's your process to actually capture these things?
It's complex. We're not allowed to record anything while driving. So it all has to be done by me scribbling notes on those little paper transfers that you have. And as soon as whoever it is gets off the bus, then I start scribbling, praying for a red light. I'm the only bus driver who wants there to be red lights. And often at night there aren't any. But I'm trying to get specifically what people said down. I want to get the dialogue. Everything else I can remember and put back together later. But what they said and how they said it, tone of voice, word choice, whatever sort of verbal body language they have, and how they choose to say things, that's really compelling to me. It shares a lot about a person, and I try to include that in the book. When you're looking at transcripts of real people talking, like court documents or presidential tape recordings, it's way different than fictional dialogue. We repeat ourselves all the time. We interrupt ourselves. We interrupt each other. And there's a sort of music to that. And I try to have the poetry of that spoken word in there because I think it's interesting. It's linguistically compelling, and it tells us a lot about the people. There's always the risk when you're sort of phoneticizing how people say stuff, if they have accents. And there's the risk of appearing that you're satirizing them. That's not the aim here. I hope it's obvious through context that we're trying to present a truthful and respectful portrait of these folks.
Yeah. I was really struck by one of the shorter stories in the book. It was about a man, and I believe that you picked him up on the E line on Aurora, and he was telling you that he was going to take a sabbatical. And like in the course of speaking to him, you realize this man has been in prison for 6 years. He got out recently. He was going to go be able to see his wife and mother. And then he, because of some small violations of his parole, had to go back to prison, probably for another 38 months or something. I mean, a long
Yeah,
time.
a number of years. Yeah.
Like, how did you choose to kind of capture that, and what were your thoughts when you were speaking to him?
Well, I always remind myself when I'm out there, I don't know the context of what these folks have been going through. And I studied photography in art school, and they would always talk about how photography is not a good medium for raising awareness because it doesn't have any context. You never see before and after. Photography always has to be supported with journalism for that reason. And in like fashion, when I'm out on the street with folks, I'm only seeing sort of a glimpse, quote unquote, photograph of them right now. I don't know what they've gone through before. And who they were before may be a very different person from who they are now. And this guy just seemed like a decent guy, you know?
He was talking about making mistakes.
Yeah, turned his life around and just seemed to have an amount of self-awareness that I had a lot of admiration for. And I couldn't help but wonder what compelled him to break parole and continue breaking parole. Was it for something beautiful? Maybe romance, maybe something, you know? And you just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And but his the way he was framing things, saying, I'm going to go on a sabbatical. For you, it was sort of like he's about to go back to a place that he was stuck in for 6 years. And his ability, and I think that's a thread in this book, is people's ability to have optimism, to find optimism even in dark places.
He's choosing to see this not very great situation he's in a positive light.
You've been driving for 18 years. And in that time, I think we've had so many additions to our lives that let us tune out the outside world. Earbuds, video games. Sure, we had those things maybe 20 years ago, but they're just so much more ubiquitous now.
Yeah.
And it's so much more likely that we're all just staring down at our phones rather than looking around.
Totally.
How do you think the public space of the bus has changed because of these things?
It has become more isolationist, more of a if we're talking Seattle freeze, it's become a little more of an ice age, and it's not my favorite. Prior to COVID, I would spend all 8 hours just talking to people. I'd be blabbing the whole time. That changed significantly, but it's slowly...
Do you think it was the pandemic or technology or a little of both?
I think it was the pandemic accelerating technology and creating an environment of suspicion and fear never helps. People need to feel safe in order to communicate with each other. And it's been a challenge, but you can feel the desire to connect still there, slowly returning. We are the social creature, we humans, and that's not going to be eradicated in the space of one generation. And you talk to young people now, and they know that social media is bad for you. They know that doom scrolling is bad for you. They're not idiots. And yet they, and I include myself in this category, everyone, we all use these devices more than we know we should. And I try to break away from that, I try to say hi to the people around me. I try to connect because it does make us feel better. And we don't want to get into a situation where we can only communicate with people via a digital intermediary. Often, maybe half of the passengers don't respond to me because they have earbuds in or they're looking at their phones. But I still say hi to them. It's my job. I'm getting paid. I'm going to greet them. They don't have to do anything. They're not getting paid, but I'm doing my best. Yeah, sort of. I feel like those of us who are fighting the Seattle freeze are doing it like one lonely soul at a time, but there's a bunch of us,
I'm a train rider. I'm sorry to say I'm not so much of a bus rider. Just
That's
happens
okay.
to be the quirk of geography of where I live.
For sure.
But I have really tried to make it a point to, at least for half my ride, not be on my phone and not be, using anything, and just watch the world go by and maybe look at some other people around. And it's hard, though. It's really hard to remind yourself to do that. And, I think I hear you say that there are benefits to doing it.
Oh, there's so much to be gained from what are the thoughts inside of my head rather than me reading other people's thoughts.
So it's clear from this book you have a lot of trust and respect for writers, and I don't want to undercut that. But I do want to bring up the fact that there's been some heightened safety concerns for drivers, particularly. We had the terrible murder of Sean Yim, a Metro driver who was stabbed in the U District, not far from where we are. Yeah. I'm so sorry for your loss. That was a horrible incident. And it was also something that put a spotlight on safety for Metro drivers. How did that loss, or how did you process that loss, and how did it change the way that you interact or that you approach the job? Did it?
Gosh, I may not have the requisite self-awareness to give a good answer to that. It might be too soon, but any person you talk to on the street will tell you that the real currency of the street is not money but respect. And how I treat people is generally how I'm going to get treated in return. Whatever energy I put out there is what I get blasted in my face times 10. And that strategy works pretty well for making situations safer. It never hurts. It's not a strategy that works every single time, of course, but no strategy does. And
I know you shared a story about, there are incidents of just random seeming aggression and violence that you can't predict and that you can't control, or when you are interacting in a way that it usually gets a positive reaction, it doesn't always.
Sometimes it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating, but the world is a place where sometimes things go well for us and sometimes they go badly. And part of this book is trying to wrestle with the size and the scariness of that reality, and to figure out a way to look at it that doesn't involve turning away from that difficult truth. Speaking with reference to Sean, I would hope that the continued discussion, citywide discussion that we're having about safety on the street, would remember to keep in mind not just safety for drivers, but for passengers as well. Installing any sort of heavy-duty militarized shield type situation to protect drivers does absolutely nothing for passengers. There needs to be some sort of shift in our understanding of what constitutes acceptable behavior on the street, much more than just protecting drivers.
Is there a favorite story that you want to leave us with?
Oh boy.
From the book, or a favorite person that you met in the course of writing the book that you captured here, that leaves us with kind of a little bright slice of your life as a Metro bus driver?
So the book is, although these are discrete stories, many of them are interlinked. There's recurring characters, and we meet them, and sometimes they're not doing so well, and then we meet them again, and we meet them another time, and we watch their lives change. There was a woman who, in the beginning of the book, has recently gotten off drugs. She's desperate to find her daughter in Minnesota, who she was sort of conned out of being able to, she was asked to sign some papers that she didn't understand, and so she no longer had access to her daughter. And she was going to go to Minnesota and be homeless, even if she needed to be, to find her daughter and reconnect with her daughter and tell her daughter that she loved her, etc. And I hear people talk about their enthusiastic plans for what they're going to do, and often it doesn't turn out. Here it did. She shows up in the book 100 pages later, and she has reconnected with her. I was almost scared to ask her when I saw her again, 6 months later. Did all of that stuff work out? Are you okay? Yeah, she was okay. It was miraculous. Truth, I think it was Mark Twain who said something like, the difference between truth and fiction is that fiction has to be plausible. In the real world, stuff can be crazy, both in the negative sense, but also in the positive. There's some intensely beautiful things I see out there. One of my favorites is when people who have been homeless on my bus, sleeping on my bus, etc., I see them on the street, I see them at their worst, and then 2 years go by, 5 years, and I see them again, barely recognize them, and they come up to me, they're like, hey, bus driver, I want to let you know, I have a job, I have an apartment, I'm a father now, etc. And I noticed that's so important for them to tell me, which is weird because I'm just the bus driver. I'm probably almost just a stranger to them, but I was the person who saw them when they were at their worst, and they want to tell me, they want to inform me, look, I'm better than that. And the humanity of that is very moving to me.
Well, it's just got a ton of really beautiful moments like that. Nathan Voss is the author of the new book, Deciding to See, The View from Nathan's Bus. Nathan, thank you so much for being here. It's really been a pleasure to read the book and also chatting with you for the first time.
Libby, so much fun to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for talking about the book with me. Thank you.
And that interview aired in May of this year. You're listening to Soundside. When we come back, many Pacific Northwest hummingbirds don't migrate thanks to a wide variety of food provided year-round by people. But those little red hummingbird feeders have done more than just provide sustenance. A new study shows they've changed the size and shape of hummingbird beaks, too. We'll hear how after the break here on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Hans Anderson. We're re-airing some of our favorite segments from the past year, and now we're going to hear about one of my favorite subjects, birds. Last month, we took a trip to see Alejandro Rico Guevara, one of the foremost researchers on hummingbird bills. Alejandro has spent years studying how hummingbirds use their beaks to feed and fight. And some of his recent research looked at how humans' actions seem to be driving a high-speed example of evolution in hummingbirds' bills. Alejandro is an assistant professor of biology at the University of Washington, and he's the co-author of a study published this year in Global Change Biology. It shows how hummingbird feeders have influenced the size and shape of hummingbird bills in a matter of decades. Alejandro spoke with Gabriel Spitzer about his research in May of this year. Here's that conversation.
So this study is about Anna's hummingbird. Can you kind of introduce us to this bird? What does it look like?
It's an amazing hummingbird that is actually all around us. It's a very urban hummingbird, so you would see it in parks. The males have reddish rose feathers. I say magenta is the color that I describe them, in their throats and their crown. So in the males, they have sort of this helmet all around, and the rest of the body is kind of greenish, grayish in the front, and the females are mostly green and gray with a few feathers in the throat, the same color as the males. But when the sun hits them right, it's just like fabulous. It's gorgeous.
Oh, wow. So why did you choose to study this particular variety of hummingbirds?
So because they are so urban, they are very adapted to being around us. And that allows the possibility to ask questions regarding how that popular pastime, which is feeding them, has influenced their shape, in this scale, the bill shape.
All right, so you're looking at the prevalence of these hummingbird feeders and then any effects that it might be having or correlating with in the hummingbirds themselves. And I wanted to ask you about how you count both of those things. So how do you figure out how many feeders are in a given place or what the trends are over time?
So that's one of the most challenging aspects of estimations. But we use as proxies, actually, because we were interested to do it through time. Then we wanted to know how popular they were. So our proxy for hummingbird feeder abundance is actually the mentions in newspapers that we can collect through time, all the way back through the same range of time where we have access to the earliest specimens.
You're talking about like ads for hummingbird feeders.
Exactly. So we search for specific words, and these words were, on one hand, feeders, and on the other hand, eucalyptus, because we were also interested in how the introduction of eucalyptus had affected both the morphology but also the distribution.
Yeah. Why eucalyptus?
Because hummingbirds feed on eucalyptus, and eucalyptus are non-native, so they are native to Australia, where actually another group of nectar-feeding birds, the Australian honeyeaters, feed from them, so they produce quite good nectar for birds. So here, hummingbirds have been drinking from them, and that's a big impact that we thought could be influencing their bill shape as well.
Yeah, so you're looking at these two kind of novel, abundant food sources and how they are affecting the actual species that feeds on them. So these hummingbird feeders, I mean, are they like the ones that we all picture that look just kind of like a bottle of sugar water that you would get at Target or something?
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing about hummingbird feeders is that regardless of the design, they have two main characteristics, all of them. So they have very large pools of nectar, basically like an unlimited flower. And they have very tiny holes in which the bills will have to go through to get to the nectar. And the diameter is mostly fixed because the companies that make them don't want bees to get in them. So they keep that hole very tight.
That's interesting. So that sort of constricts who can feed out of it, and it rewards anything with a very narrow little straw to stick in there.
That's exactly right.
So, okay, then you have to compare that to hummingbird changes over time. How do you go about doing that? How do you do a historical analysis of hummingbirds? I mean, are there records kept somewhere? How do you do that?
So that's the beauty of museum collections. So we go back in time and we take advantage of collectors that thought that having these specimens systematically collected throughout the years could let us know more about the world. In this particular case, we were able to analyze how the bill shape changed from the 1800s all the way to today.
Wow. And so these are the collections that are sort of behind closed doors at lots of different museums, stuck in like a big archival looking, set of drawers and cabinets of a whole bunch of preserved animals, right?
That is exactly right. So at the Berkeley Museum, we have those behind the doors collections, but the work that we do with them is actually you can see the work through glass walls. So that's one of the things that we're trying to promote, making it more open to the public to see what actually happens behind those doors.
All right. So you wanted to understand how these food sources, feeders and eucalyptus trees, might change the actual animal, the morphology of the animal, what it looks like, what it's shaped like over time. Once you got all your data, what did you find?
Okay, so here's what you do. To collect the data, you take photos, and we have two ways to take photos, just 2D shape, one photo from above, one photo from the side, and then you can do the shape analysis, which is basically going around the bill, the counter of the bill, and then you get that. But we also have a new way to analyze the bills in 3D to ground truth the inferences that we were getting from that. What we learned was that the hummingbirds that are more associated to areas where the abundance of feeders is high have more slender bills and elongated.
Longer and slimmer bills.
Yes. So bills get longer, and while they're getting longer, they also get thinner relatively to the whole length. So when you would imagine that you would make a bill grow larger, then if you make it grow large in all dimensions, then it would get thicker, it would get wider. But in this case, what is happening is just that it's getting long, but the thinnest along the bill is maintaining the same.
Okay, so you're seeing this change over the course of hummingbird generations. What is it adapting to exactly?
So what we infer is that these changes are favoring a higher extraction of nectar per unit time. So it's like sucking water through a larger straw. That being said, hummingbirds don't use suction to drink nectar. That's what we have actually studied for many, many years. So we had very clear expectations about how the bills would change in which dimensions, because we have figured out each part of the mechanism of the drinking, which we know how the tongues collect the nectar, we know how the nectar is transferred through the long bills, and all of that set the expectations that we ended up finding. So there is a little constriction in the middle of the bill, and that makes the near the tip has some of thickening because they squeeze the nectar and then they move it through. So it's a complicated process, but the expectations were met when we analyzed the shape.
And then they use their bills for other stuff too, right? It's not only for feeding. What did you find around some of the other functions that their bills have and how those might have changed in response to the feeders?
Yeah, so one that was sort of like perfectly in opposition to lengthening the bill in association with feeders was the fact that in colder regions now they have shorter, stubbier bills. And that's because we also show in this paper that they can thermoregulate using their bills. In previous studies, they show that they use their feet to exchange heat. So when they're very hot, they keep the feet out. When they're cold, they put them back in. But here we show that when they're not hovering, when they're perched, they can use the bill to exchange heat. So a smaller bill would be keeping the heat more, closely to your body, and therefore you wouldn't lose that much heat. So it's convenient.
Got it. And then there's at least one other kind of main job that the bills have, right, related to competing for resources and so on. What did you find in regards to that?
So another characteristic that feeders have is that they are unlimited flowers, and that means that it's a very good resource for them to defend. So what we found is that the only males that are associated to feeders, they have sharper bill tips and more triangular bills overall, which would be better for transmit the force when they're poking each other.
And what are those? What does that look like? Just out of curiosity.
So when we also do work with high-speed videos, and we see them basically flying against the other and jamming their bills, whatever they can. Sometimes they bite, sometimes they just, joust against each other.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. They're like lances.
Exactly, yes.
Wow. And so these hummingbird feeders seem to have increased the competition, which has led to sharper beaks.
Correct. So the inference that we would like to test now is that they are fighting more around these feeders, and then the males that have more sword-like bills, they are more successful around them.
Yeah. So just to zoom out for a second, over how long of a period have these changes been measured?
So we measured in a period of 160 years. So in hummingbird generations, that's quite short. It's only like about 10 to 15 generations. So it's a very rapid change.
10 or 15 generations, and you see these measurable changes. I mean, we're used to thinking about evolution as happening over these long time scales, like thousands of years or millions of years. And here we're talking about evolution that happens over decades. What do we take from that? I mean, is this a special case, or does that suggest that this rapid evolution is happening a lot more often than we're generally aware of?
I think it's the latter. I think evolution happens all the time, and it's just when you start looking into these time series that we sometimes need to collect as a baseline to later understand how things change, and this is exactly what we found.
Is the change universal across Andes hummingbirds? Are there some that still have the older model beaks?
So in areas in which there is not that many feeders, we find that this is more like what the old hummingbirds, to call it that way, have. So we were able to disentangle things like urbanization or population abundance from this change. So we separated all these factors, and it turns out that it's not that these hummingbirds live in cities, it's not that these hummingbirds live around more denser areas. It's just the areas in which feeders were popular, those were the ones which found the change.
So a lot of people have backyard bird feeders just for fun because they like to look at them. Some I've seen now a lot of these smart feeders that'll take high-speed video of your little birdie visitors and so on. Is anything in your research sort of shed light on what people should do or what people are already doing and might not realize?
We see that there is a change in association with the feeders. I don't think we can label that as good or bad. It's just nature adapting to this world that we are offering. I personally prefer to plant a bunch of flowers and then have the hummingbirds still, surviving and thriving, but without more artificial resources. But, when you think about it, those flowers are also, the ones that make it through the winter are not, natural either. And so it's all a gradient of what you feel comfortable with. And I think, I personally don't think that we can say it's good or bad. It's just a response to this world.
You've been a hummingbird guy for at least 10 years, right? So I wonder, was there anything new or particularly interesting or exciting that you learned about these creatures in this particular experiment?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is just fascinating that we have learned so much about hummingbirds looking across species. And those patterns, for instance, the change in bill shape, you see different species with these extremes, and now you see those changes within a species, and also with the what we call bill weapons. So we have some species that have extreme bill weapons, we have species without the weapons, and now we're seeing how these could emerge. So the earliest stages of these processes, and we see it literally happening in front of our eyes now that we have the museum specimens to back it up.
Alejandro Rico Guevara is an assistant professor of biology at the University of Washington. Alejo, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
And that segment originally aired in June of this year.